Tonight we begin with a development that foreign policy experts had feared, dismissed, and quietly prepared for. A decision that unfolded not over weeks of deliberation, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that fundamentally altered the calculus of proxy warfare. 72 hours that shattered decades of carefully maintained constraints. 72 hours that placed the United States closer to direct confrontation with a nuclear power than at any moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What the Biden administration authorized this week crossed a line that even the most hawkish NATO strategists had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Moscow did not hesitate. They responded with clarity, precision, and barely concealed fury. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official policy papers, not formal NATO communiques, just signals that the White House was preparing something unprecedented in the Ukrainian theater. The administration has been supportive of Kyiv, yes, but they have been calculatedly restrained in their support. Their weapons transfers have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a choreography designed to aid Ukraine without triggering Russian red lines. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow and Beijing this Tuesday was that the rhythm went silent. Arms control specialists who monitor escalatory patterns know the indicators, the carefully staged rollout of weapon systems, the months-long gap between authorization and delivery, the public denials followed by quiet confirmations, the deliberate ambiguity about operational restrictions. All of that went quiet. And whenever Washington goes quiet on weapons policy, it means something is about to get loud. Early Thursday morning, Russian defense monitoring systems detected what they described as long-range precision strikes deep inside Russian territory, including targeting patterns that had not been observed in over 8 decades of modern warfare. These are the kinds of strikes that the United States only authorizes when they are signaling something very specific, that geographical boundaries no longer apply, that escalation dominance is the strategy, or that direct great power confrontation is now acceptable risk. Intelligence analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Biden was changing the fundamental posture of American involvement. And when nuclear-armed superpowers shift strategic posture without explanation, even by incremental measures, the entire international system pays attention. The warning issued by the Kremlin tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior Russian officials, after Emergency Security Council meetings, described Biden's authorization as reckless, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, crossing thresholds that existed precisely because their breach makes containment impossible. But deterrence only works if the target hesitates. Moscow did not. In fact, their response today was among the most explicit nuclear signaling we've seen in post-Cold War history. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of confirmed American-supplied missile strikes on Russian soil, Moscow altered its nuclear doctrine. These weren't the routine updates to military planning documents. These were formal amendments to state policy, doctrinal changes that Russia only implements when they are preparing to lower the threshold for nuclear weapons use. Tonight, Western intelligence sources confirmed that Ukraine launched ATACMS strikes on military installations inside Russia's Bryansk region, including ammunition depots that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was protection against exactly this scenario. Ukraine struck before Russia could disperse its stockpiles. They hit command and control facilities. They hit logistics hubs. They hit staging areas that were likely preparing to support winter offensive operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted Russia's operational infrastructure, the connective tissue that would have made sustained offensive campaigns viable. This is what made Chomsky's analysis so urgent. Biden's authorization wasn't just symbolic, it was operationally transformative. It represented the kind of move that could collapse the distinction between proxy war and direct confrontation if left unanswered. And Russia, understanding that fully, responded with doctrinal revision, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't escalate militarily on the battlefield. They didn't launch retaliatory strikes on NATO infrastructure. They changed the rules governing when they might use nuclear weapons. They formalized what was previously unthinkable. And here's where the story becomes even more alarming. European security analysts now believe that Biden's latest authorization was designed to test the resolve of Russian deterrence after months of incremental Western escalation without consequence. The White House wanted to see whether Moscow would accept strategic strikes on Russian territory as the new normal, but instead the opposite happened. The Kremlin didn't normalize the violation. They responded with nuclear posture changes that were so immediate, so formalized, that even NATO command noticed. You don't get Vladimir Putin's attention through conventional escalation anymore, but today Biden did. Former State Department officials speaking with foreign policy journals under anonymity described Biden's decision as brinksmanship, a way to strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position before potential peace talks. But Russia proved today that they remain both willing and able to raise stakes. Their doctrinal changes were not only swift, they were calibrated so precisely that Western nuclear strategists immediately recognized the specific scenarios being addressed. That precision matters because it shows this wasn't panic. It shows that Russia is not passively absorbing Western escalation. They are actively redefining what constitutes existential threat worthy of nuclear response. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Russia's doctrinal response. And the revised nuclear doctrine now explicitly permits nuclear weapons use in response to conventional attacks that threaten Russian sovereignty. Russian state media broadcast the changes within hours, signaling the shift was meant for both domestic and international audiences. Strategic rocket forces operating across 11 time zones reportedly conducted readiness drills used by Moscow to demonstrate nuclear operational capability. This wasn't just diplomatic signaling. This wasn't just rhetorical escalation. This was formal policy revision. This was doctrinal transformation. And doctrinal clarity is the one thing nuclear powers have struggled to maintain since the end of Cold War bipolarity. For every incremental Western weapons transfer, Russia has countered with something that complicates the theory of manageable escalation. Remember, Washington thought limited strikes would demonstrate resolve. They thought Moscow would protest symbolically, but ultimately accept the new reality. They thought proxy war could be intensified indefinitely without triggering great power conflict. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Russia has formalized new thresholds. Moscow has demonstrated institutional decisiveness. The Kremlin has shown that American escalation will be met with Russian redefinition of what constitutes unacceptable threat. What makes this moment so dangerous and so predictable is that Biden's authorization happened at a time when his administration is under enormous domestic political pressure. Progressive Democrats want de-escalation and negotiated settlement. Republican hawks want maximalist support for Ukrainian victory. European allies want American security guarantees without nuclear risk. Ukrainian leadership wants weapons without restrictions. Biden is balancing these demands while facing a lame duck transition period with institutional authority evaporating daily. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The State Department's statement, now circulated through diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russian territorial gains to be consolidated through winter offensives. Pentagon officials said plainly that Russia's invasion was inconsistent with the rules-based international order. That is bureaucratic language for, we're changing the rules of our involvement because the current rules aren't producing the outcomes we want. You don't usually hear that level of candor from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed the nation in a somber, resolute speech tonight. He said, "We will defend every centimeter of our territory with every weapon our partners provide." He said, "Sovereignty is not negotiable, and neither are the means of its defense." And he said, "Those who empower us to strike the source of aggression empower the cause of freedom itself." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leadership that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Biden's authorization wasn't isolated. Along with ATACMS strikes deep into Russia, Britain confirmed Storm Shadow missile transfers would have no geographical restrictions. France indicated similar policy regarding Scalp missiles. Germany continued refusing Taurus transfers, citing precisely the escalation risks now materializing. All of this happened within the same 96-hour window. When the United States moves multiple alliance pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Strategic analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Biden is preparing to hand Trump a fait accompli, a fundamentally altered strategic landscape that constrains the incoming administration's negotiating flexibility. Another is that the White House is attempting to maximize Ukraine's battlefield position before winter freezes the front lines and forces diplomatic engagement. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Biden is attempting to call what he believes is a Russian bluff on nuclear threats, gambling that Putin will not actually escalate beyond conventional means. But today, Russia took that gamble off the table. They didn't issue vague warnings. They didn't threaten unspecified consequences. They didn't rely on state media innuendo. They changed formal nuclear doctrine. What we're watching now is a test of resolve at the nuclear threshold. Biden wants to see whether Russia will tolerate strategic strikes on Russian territory. Russia wants to show that territorial strikes trigger doctrinal shifts toward nuclear consideration. NATO wants to prevent Russian territorial consolidation. Moscow wants to prevent Western normalization of strikes on Russian soil. Tonight, we've heard from arms control experts who are now monitoring Russian nuclear force readiness levels. They say the doctrinal changes are accompanied by observable changes in operational posture. They say Russia's updated doctrine explicitly addresses scenarios matching current Ukrainian operations. And they say Biden's decision to authorize long-range strikes is likely part of a broader strategy intended to strengthen Western negotiating leverage before Trump takes office. But Russia is not accepting this framework. In fact, Russia is rejecting the premise that proxy war can intensify indefinitely without great power confrontation. Their response today, immediate, formalized, and doctrinally embedded, sent a message to Washington that escalation will be matched with escalation. And it sent a message to NATO that Russian deterrence remains credible and operational. As the transition period continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Biden hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that Chomsky's warning was timely. It identified the risks inherent in great power brinkmanship. It highlighted the instability of lame duck foreign policy decisions. And it reminded us that nuclear-armed states do not bluff indefinitely. So what happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next 72 hours. If they respond only doctrinally, this moment will be remembered as a dangerous but contained crisis. If they respond operationally, both Washington and Brussels have already shown they are unprepared for the consequences. They have shown they are ready to escalate, but readiness to escalate is not the same as readiness for what escalation produces. And tonight, for the first time in decades, Washington appears to be testing assumptions that were retired for very good reasons. The Pentagon is quiet, too quiet. And when the Pentagon is quiet after authorizing strikes on a nuclear power's territory, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, the Biden administration learned something that every Cold War strategist knew instinctively. Nuclear powers do not accept unlimited conventional escalation. Proxy wars do not remain proxy wars when American weapons strike Russian soil. And doctrinal thresholds exist precisely because their violation makes everything that follows unpredictable. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The rules governing great power conflict have changed. The constraints that prevented direct confrontation have eroded, and the world is now closer to nuclear escalation than at any point since the Soviet Union collapsed. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.